In this video, we're going to look at how we can find an endpoint of a segment given its midpoint and another endpoint. So first thing is we'll look at how do we do this graphically. So if we're going to do this graphically, you're going to want to plot your endpoint and the midpoint, and you're going to want to count the distance. So we're going to look at it graphically first. So you're going to count distance from the endpoint to the midpoint, and then you're going to repeat the distance. To find the other endpoint. So let's look at what that means. So you're basically gonna have to find the other endpoint when you're given one endpoint of the segment and the midpoint of that segment. So you know that since the midpoint is in the middle, the distance on either side of the midpoint has to be the same. So that's why you count the distance from one endpoint to the midpoint, and then you just repeat it. So on the graph below, let's do this graphically. So we're going to start with plotting our points. So we have a segment with given endpoint has midpoint M. So A is an endpoint, and M is going to be the midpoint. We want to find the other endpoint. So meaning we want to find coordinate, let's say B. That's what we need to find. So if I go and plot my point, 6, 2, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up 2. There's A. M is 2, 0, so over 2, and then just stay there. And here's my endpoint, here's my midpoint. So I'm not trying to find the point in the middle of these, I'm trying to find the other endpoint. So this is the middle of the segment. So it has to be between points A and B. So that really means point B has to be somewhere over here so that the distance between these 2 points is the same as the distance between M and B. So what you're going to do is you're going to count that distance. So from A to M, so I had to go down 2, and then I had to go over 1, 2, 3, 4. So we repeat that distance. So according to our directions, we count the distance and then you repeat it because you have to make it the same distance. So I'm going to go down 2 again and then over 1, 2, 3, 4. So here's where point B will be. So now here's my entire segment. These 2 parts have to be equal since M is the midpoint. I know that they're equal because I counted the same way. So the coordinates of B are going to be -2, -2. So now we're going to look at how do we do this algebraically. So algebraically, we don't really have a formula for algebraically. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to add and subtract numbers to be able to figure out that same distance. So we're going to line the coordinates up. So we're going to line them up vertically. So line coordinates up vertically. And figure out the numbers that we added or subtracted from the endpoint to get the midpoint, and repeat repeat the addition or subtraction from the midpoint using those numbers, and repeat addition / subtraction from midpoint to find the other endpoint. This will make more sense once you guys see it. So if we actually go through and do this algebraically, the first step step says line coordinates up vertically. So what that means, kind of like what I have set up here, but I'm just going to write a little bit bigger. So I'm going to rewrite my coordinates, and I'm going to write them vertically. So M is the midpoint, and B is what I'm trying to find. So I'm going to leave that one empty, and I'm leaving space between them. So then the next thing it says is we want to find what numbers did we add or subtract to go from A to M. So essentially it's, instead of counting the distance on a graph, you're just looking at the addition or subtraction. So the change in X values is the same thing as what did you move left or right. And then the change in the Y values is the same thing as saying up or down. So to go from 6 to 2, I had to subtract 4, which since it's to the X values, if you subtract, it really means left 4. So you repeat that process. So whatever you subtracted from the first endpoint to the midpoint, you're going to go from the midpoint, you're going to subtract it, that same number. So 2 minus 4 gives me -2. And then we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it for the Y values. So to go from 2 to 0, we had to subtract 2, which really meant down 2. Because if for Y's, if you're subtracting, it means down. If you're adding, it would mean up. For X's, subtracting means left. Addition means right. So subtracting 2, because we moved down 2, we have to repeat that. Because you have to make that distance the same, so we get -2. So same answer, different way of doing it. But if you look at your picture over here on the graph, down 2, left 4, we went down 2, left 4. So same thing, same numbers. Down 2 meant subtract from 2 from the Y's. Left 4 meant subtract 4 from the X's. And it's the same numbers both times because you have to make that distance the same on either side. So either way will work. Knowing the algebraic way will be beneficial when you have messy numbers with decimals and things. Graphing is sometimes easier, but doesn't work all the time when you have decimals. So that's why you got to know both methods.